questions as we start, if you do want to do that, or I hear that there are some good wines as well there as well. All right. Go. All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, here in person as well as online joining us via Zoom. Before we begin, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And equally, I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which all of our online participants are on, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. NATO's Madrid summit in June brought about the alliance's long-awaited new strategic concept, which delivered an assessment of a much more adversarial international environment and set out a vision for at least the next decade. While the document makes it clear the 30-country strong alliance is attuned to the challenges that come outside of its core geographical and functional areas, it is pretty much clear that the alliance will be looking much closer to home given Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the threats to NATO's eastern flank. Yet the fact that the Indo-Pacific as a region received a mention for the very first time in NATO's strategic communication of this type, and that Australia implicitly got called upon as a major partner that will be crucial in enacting the alliance's strategic ambitions, is something that we shouldn't underestimate. So to discuss the details of NATO's 2022 strategic concept and its implications for Australia, I am very pleased I am able to welcome a stellar panel of experts and practitioners with us here tonight or this morning, depending on the location you are zooming in from. So let's start from who we have just here in the room. Ms. Chiara Spencer is the first Assistant Secretary of the International Security Division at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and has just flown in from Canberra. So we are very grateful to Chiara for being here. She is responsible for defense and intelligence policy, cybersecurity, critical technology, counterterrorism, disinformation, people smuggling, and human trafficking at the department. Chiara has extensive experience working across the Australian Public Service with expertise in national security, law enforcement, transnational crime, and international law. And she's been with DFAT for the past over half a year, as I heard just in our chat prior to the event. Then online, we have Dr. Benedetta Berti, who is the head of the Policy Planning Unit in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO in Brussels, joining us from over there. And it is her team that was basically tasked with devising the kind of strategic concepts that we saw unveiled at the Madrid summit. Dr. Berti is also an associate researcher at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at Vrije Universiteit Brussels, visiting professor at the College of Europe and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a prolific academic, writer, and a commentator. And again, I'm very thankful for her taking time so early in her day to be here with us. And last but not the least, Professor Stefan Frühling from the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University in Canberra, obviously, but not zooming in from Canberra, zooming in from Kyoto, Japan. So we are doing a bit of this Indo-Pacific link. Professor Frühling teaches and researches basically everything that is connected to Australian defense policy, defense planning and strategy, nuclear weapons, and NATO. He's a former Fulbright scholar at Georgetown and a NATO scholar at the NATO Defense College in Rome, where we actually shared the same fellowship, but Stefan was there way before me. So he can make that sort of claim to fame. And finally, my name is Gorana Grgic. I'm a senior lecturer at the US Studies Center, which is organizing this event, but also I'm jointly appointed with the discipline of government and international relations here at Sydney University School of Social and Political Sciences. And this is basically the last sort of capstone event in a series of events that we've been doing in collaboration with the NATO public diplomacy team for the past year as a way to identify areas of collaboration and further sort of deepening of relations between Australia and NATO as they related to the unveiling of the new strategic concept. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to everyone online as well for joining us. I am very grateful that we have this opportunity to have a bit more of a robust discussion and with people who are really in the know and who live and breathe the different sort of aspects of these relationships and of the new strategic concept. So if all of our panelists don't mind, we will start just by hearing from each of them just some opening remarks. We might start with Dr. Berti, who will give us that view from Brussels, and then over to Professor Fruling, and then coming back here and getting a perspective from DFAT from Ms. Spencer.
Great. So I'll take it from there, I guess. Good morning from Riga, not quite Brussels, but close enough. I'm going to be very quick, I hope, and try to briefly underline why this new strategic concept matters in terms of understanding how the alliance is changing its strategic outlook and how it's preparing itself for what it sees as an inherently more complex, dangerous, and volatile security environment. Just to start in terms of the preface, the strategic concept is a good way to understand how NATO is thinking strategically. It is, in terms of the internal hierarchy of documents, the second most important document in NATO's structure after the North Atlantic Treaty. It is this is the 8th time since 1949 that the Allies have come together to agree such a strategic document. So in that sense, it is every time this exercise is carried out, it is an important political chance to foster consensus and to foster cohesion, but it's also a good way to understand how we're changing our strategic thinking. And in 5 minutes, I think one of the best ways to understand how far we've come in our analysis of the world and our understanding of what NATO has to do, it's to compare and contrast very quickly the 2010 and the 2022 strategic concept, because I think that's a quick way to see where we were and where we are. So 2010 is the last time the Allies sat together to do this exercise, and the main messages in that concept were, if I were to summarize, the Euro-Atlantic area is at peace. The European security order is based on stability and cooperation. Of course, we will face threats and challenges to our security, but these are more likely to come from without the area of responsibility rather than from within. And they are likely to come in the form of asymmetric and conventional threats, terrorism, and we're going to have to do more and more of crisis management, operation at strategic distance. And of course, Afghanistan at the time was the biggest operational engagement of the alliance. That strategic concept reflects a fundamentally post-Cold War vision of the world, if I had to summarize it. Now, fast forward to 2022, this last time that we conducted this exercise, I think you can mind my assessment is that what we agreed is the first post-Cold War strategic concept, in the sense that we deliberately started our security assessment by saying the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. that main assumption that underlined our way of thinking for over 30 years is no longer valid. This is, of course, because Russia's brutal and unprovoked war of aggression on Ukraine. It's also because of more of a decade of destabilizing and aggressive behavior by Russia. So whereas in 2010, we were talking about the desire and the ambition to build a strategic partnership with Russia, in 2022, we are much more realistic, I would say, and cognizant of what the reality is today. And so this is a strategic concept that clearly, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, identifies the Russian Federation as a threat to Allied security and to Euro-Atlantic peace and stability. And on the basis of that assessment, places at the very center of what we need to do, strengthening our deterrence and defense and boosting our resilience against coercion, subversion, and malign interference, whilst maintaining open channels of communication. But I want to underline, we're talking about channels of communications, not dialogue. That's a difference. So that's in the background, but I would say that that stopping at this element, stopping at the Russian war against Ukraine and Russia's destabilizing behavior tells us a good part of the story, but doesn't tell us the whole story. I think what's really emerging from this strategic concept is that we see strategic competition as being one of the defining feature of our security environment. And this is a concept that talks about the fact that today we see assertive authoritarian powers pushing back against the rules-based international order, promoting authoritarian models of governance, seeking to undermine our cohesion, societies, and democracy through both military and non-military means, including economic coercion, including energy blackmail, including disinformation. So really using the full spectrum of military and non-military tools. And that's a very different understanding of the security environment of what we had in 2010. This is an environment which we're constantly challenging and contested, and therefore not just we need to step up our ability to do deterrence and defense against conventional and non-conventional threats, but we also have to dig in and really step up our work on boosting our own resilience and working with our partners to mitigate our strategic vulnerabilities and to harden our infrastructure, society, and democracies. So that's a completely, I would say, new angle in a strategic concept. Of course, NATO had been going in that direction for more than a couple of years now, but I think that's very important that it's now reflected in the NATO strategy. And of course, and I'll close here because I want to stick to the 5 minutes, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in the context of understanding strategic competition, this is the first strategic concept that mentions China. And it doesn't just mention China. It talks about the fact that Chinese coercive policies, stated objectives and coercive policies can pose a challenge our interest, our values, and our security. It talks about the need of the transatlantic community to come together to tackle the systemic challenges posed by the PRC to Euro-Atlantic security. That is absolutely I would say, a very important development in the way we're talking and thinking about the PRC. In terms of approach, we're talking about increasing our situational awareness. We're talking about boosting our resilience, boosting our preparedness, working more deliberately to defend and protect the rules-based international order, and of course, working more with like-minded partners to do all this. And that will be my last 30 seconds in the sense that on the basis of this rather grim description of the security environment characterized by fragility, strategic competition, recurring shocks, the enduring challenge of the enduring threat of terrorism, the existential challenge of climate change, all of this is depicted in our strategic concept. And therefore, the focus right now is first, second, and third, to boost our deterrence and defense and to reset ourselves up to do collective defense in a way that we hadn't really done for decades, and this is already well on its way. But at the same time, retaining a global understanding of how threats and challenges are connected, and that's where the work with partners, and I'll stop here, comes in, and that's why this is a strategic concept that puts partnerships at the very core of our thinking about how to ensure our security and working with our partners to support theirs. And in that context, we talk about working more with like-minded partners who share our values and commitment to the rules-based international order. And of course, in that context, we also talk more about the importance of strengthening our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, we're thinking about our Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Korea, and we can talk more about the fact that I believe the relationship between NATO, the partnership with NATO in Australia is really going from strength to strength over the past years. And to very close, and I promise, as I was already said in your introduction, we're talking more and more about the connections. And I think that's really, really important. The fact that the strategic concept acknowledges that security developments in the Indo-Pacific have an impact on Euro-Atlantic security, I think it's a really good step forward and also a way to think about how we can continue to further our partnership. And now I've really stopped. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Professor Friveling.
Yeah, thank you. Now, and I think that's a really good segue into what I was going to say, because I wanted to focus a bit on those interlinkages between Euro-Atlantic, in particular NATO, like security and policy, and what it means for Australia. And I think one might summarize this as, I mean, NATO is the key to the defense of the free world. Australia is, of course, not a member of NATO, but it is interested in its growth, development, and operations, since the protection it affords extends far beyond the geographic area covered by its members' nations. But apart from what is at times inaptly called consultation, there's no existing machinery in which the voice of Australia can be heard in the formulation of decisions which directly bear on our destiny. So we in Australia are firmly support NATO, but it's inevitable that the importance and extensive nature of its deliberations and planning will affect not only the interests of its members, but also those of non-members. And it's not unnatural, accordingly, that Australia is especially concerned to ensure that its interests and the interests of other areas of the world are not inadvertently overlooked by members of NATO. Now, if some of those turns of phrases kind of strike you as a bit of odd, it's because they're not actually mine, but they're from 1952, a speech that Percy Spender gave on NATO and Pacific security. So I thought that it's quite striking as a passage, though, because it highlights that although we've come to think about our partnership and the relevance of NATO in the context of growing in the context of Afghanistan and NATO out of area, the kind of European deterrent security focused NATO that we're starting to see emerge again was seen and I think was during the decades of the Cold War just as relevant for us, even if it didn't maybe kind of like express itself in quite as deep a partnership as we see now, although even many of those exchanges date from a long time ago. So where did these more underlying kind of like relevance of NATO for Australia lie? Let's start with the negative. I mean, NATO is not a global alliance, and I think it's important to kind of not read NATO interests in the Indo-Pacific as kind of like a rekindling of those thought bubbles about a global NATO that we saw kind of like rise in the 2004, 5, 6 kind of like time period, when NATO arguably was looking for more relevance. So it's important to be precise about what we mean by NATO. It's not, I mean, it's in Australia, that's important. It's also in Europe, it's often a bit going all over the place. NATO as an organization, or do we talk about NATO as the collective of its particular European member states? And so I think that NATO as an organization, and we can delve into that, I think for a whole of this reason, will not become an Indo-Pacific security player, or it's unlikely. But I do think that what we are seeing is that NATO as the collective of its European members and Canada do show and are interested in greater engagement in our region. And so I think that the Madrid summit statement and the new strategic concept are kind of like a symptom more than a cause of that. And you can also see that in, for example, the European participation in Pitch Black, and also going back to 1999, the very significant European participation in the Interfed operation, of how relevant that is. And I think our NATO partnership is an opportunity with the organization, is an opportunity in fostering that development. So that brings me to the first more enduring point, which is that NATO really is a quite unique forum for political strategic exchange. And that's really what even Percy Spender back in 1952 was already quite concerned or focused on. A lot of this is in the NATO summits, but even more so, I think, in some ways, at the level of the permanent representatives in the NAC. Again, this is not really new that this is relevant for us. I mean, Japan, for example, started engaging with the NAC in '79 in the context of the INF discussions. But the NAC has kind of like reawoken to what it used to be in some ways during the Cold War. And it has become a really important conduit through which European capitals engage with Indo-Pacific security, which is really important because we've got 30 allies, very few of which have any national kind of like expertise on our region. So, for example, the creation of the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security was hugely influential here and has really shifted NATO discussions on China Indo-Pacific security a huge way within just a few years. Australia is engaging in that through seconded officials, but I think we can do a lot more, and particularly at the ambassadorial level and in the embassy. So, for example, Japan has an ambassador accredited to NATO alone. Caroline Miller has to cover the EU as well as NATO and a few bits and bobs, Belgium and other things. That's a very big plate, and I think we're a bit underdone there. The second thing that I think is worth highlighting is that NATO remains the world's closest and most institutionalized alliance, and I think the Madrid decisions and the new strategic concept reinforce that. We used to be really positively envious about that back in the 50s. Perhaps not anymore, but NATO remains the only successful model for how do you do multilateral deterrence at an alliance level, which is something that I think is becoming increasingly important for us in the Indo-Pacific. And so it's not that unusual that people continue to look to NATO as a possible model for the evolution of Indo-Pacific alliances. And I mean, that includes even somebody like Kevin Rudd, for example, who last year co-authored a report with the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, which argued for an Indo-Pacific nuclear planning group that would involve Australia as well as Japan, South Korea, and the US. I think that fundamentally misunderstands what the nuclear planning group in NATO is actually doing, but I think it shows how much what happens in NATO influences the thinking about the future of our own alliances, and perhaps no more so than the era of nuclear sharing. Japan and South Korea, there have been increasing voices for, I mean, quote, NATO-like arrangements on nuclear sharing over the last 5 and 10 years ago. And I think that these are not as easily dismissed in Washington anymore as they were 5 or 10 years ago. So I think it's important to think through what might the consequences of the fact that the NPG and all those kind of arrangements at the moment are getting a fairly good workout. And how they will perform in the current crisis, I think, will have lasting consequences for us, just because it will shape the debate and thinking about the future of Indo-Pacific alliances. And it probably should more than it does in Canberra, but certainly here in Japan, for example, it very much does. And the third role is that NATO has always mattered to us as a developer of interoperability and capability. And that's really the core strength of NATO in many ways, which we've always imported indirectly through the ABCA technical formats. We started directly engaging with that in the early 90s. And it's this area that's really kind of taken off in the context of the NATO partnership. Although I must also say that, I mean, for NATO, the fact that they opened a lot of these forums to us was politically significant in a way that it never really was for us, which I think has also, where we've kind of tended to talk past each other for a while. But I think, again, NATO and Australia are now looking at the same strategic issues that Benedetta just mentioned. I mean, great power competition and conflict. That's actually quite unusual historically that our interests on the technical level align this much. You might also add emerging things like, for example, climate change, where I think NATO has also launched a number of new initiatives at Madrid summits. I mean, some are a bit more gimmicky than others, but I think there's also some quite fundamental work that's being done and that will inform future directions there. And I think that will certainly remain an important element in which NATO, despite its new direction, will remain really important. So I think in conclusion, I think the idea that we would just maintain a pilot-light setting in our engagement with NATO after Afghanistan clearly has not come to pass, and I think was kind of that suggestion was somewhat historically ill-informed. It does remain relevant for us and for much more enduring reasons. And I think that the shrinking of the world in geographic, in terms of travel, Zoom, economic linkages, and so on, will probably mean that those enduring relevances will show up as greater levels of activities and partnerships than they may have done in Percy Spender's time. But I don't think that the kind of directions that NATO has taken in the NATO summit fundamentally change that in any kind of way. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And from Percy Spender to Chiara Spencer.
Close, but not quite. Look, thank you. And my comments probably follow on quite closely with the other panelists. You know, there has been a lot of attention paid to the fact that NATO mentioned the Indo-Pacific and China for the first time in the strategic concept. What has been seen less is the framing of that. It's still very focused on NATO territory, but a recognition that the threats are global and interconnected. And so very much, you know, I don't think we're talking about NATO involving itself in the Indo-Pacific, but an indication that it understands that the Indo-Pacific region is affected by the shift in the geopolitical balance, and that has major risks for the NATO region as well as for the rest of the world. And the focus has really been there on boosting shared awareness, enhancing resilience and preparedness, and calling on NATO partners to support them in that. We have and do still believe that NATO has an important role to play in the political and diplomatic engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and we support NATO's allies' focus and strategic cooperation in the region, particularly the strong and consistent NATO messaging against grey zone and hybrid tactics in the Indo-Pacific in the maritime domain, the importance of the rule-based order and shaping acceptable behaviour. And the other aspect is that there has always been a range of shared security concerns beyond the geostrategic issues around cyber disinformation, maritime, counterterrorism, climate change, women, peace and security, and crisis prevention and management. So it goes beyond that kind of, you know, NATO's always talked about in terms of a military alliance, which is an important part, but it is a much broader security focus. In including the Indo-Pacific in the strategic concept, there's been more of a public recognition and a further step in strengthening the relationships that NATO has already got with its AP4 members, with the Asia Pacific members, so ourselves, Japan, Korea and New Zealand. You know, this came to the fore with the invitation to the AP4 to attend the NATO Leaders Summit. And prior to that, and actually in April, the foreign ministers attended the foreign minister meeting around the invasion of Ukraine. Even before this, the last couple of years, NATO has been strengthening those relationships. We've seen step-ups in political dialogue and practical cooperation in several areas, particularly in cyberspace, critical technology and countering disinformation. We had the foreign ministers meetings, and Australia, as well as our AP4 colleagues, quite often participate in the North Atlantic Council meetings to discuss security issues, including maritime security and climate change. And they're really seeking our perspective on those issues and understanding that the interconnectedness, there's still regional differences and different regional perspectives that they really want to learn from. Those discussions enhance the situational awareness on security developments in both the Euro-Atlantic and Asia-Pacific region, and really contribute that unique perspective. NATO also has individual partnership cooperation programs with each member of the AP4. For Australia, that includes cooperative activities on topics of mutual interest, particularly cyber defence, non-proliferation, civil preparedness, and women, peace and security. And there's a lot of practical cooperation that happens under those. I would say, you know, and going to my colleague's point, our relationship with NATO is well established, but it continues to evolve. It's moved beyond joint operations, and now we've got structured dialogues and practical cooperation on those shared security challenges. It's based on the values we share, which become more important in this era of competition, but also of our experience of working together, including in Afghanistan, Iraq, in the NATO Centres of Excellence, NATO headquarters, and most recently as well as part of Operation Sea Guardian 2022. And also on that common vision and shared values and importance of a rules-based order. And just to the other point around the kind of focus we have on these issues, we have, I think, mentioned Caroline Miller, who is a force on her own in terms of driving Australia's work with NATO. We also have a number of senior Australian Defence Force members in Brussels working with NATO, and quite apart from that, a whole range of Australian officers embedded in NATO headquarters, at the centres of excellence, and briefing at committee meetings in the Atlantic Council. So there is an awful lot of engagement that has happened over time, and the interests and the focus of that within NATO have shifted, but we're definitely seeing an increased demand for our perspective and the perspective of our AP4 colleagues of what we're seeing in our region to inform those kind of global and interconnected threats.
And I actually wanted to kick off some questions by asking you more, as Professor Frühling preempted on the kind of level of engagement, you know, that we could parse through the sort of resources that are committed to that cooperation. So as you said, we are seeing the relationship evolve. So to that extent, can we expect that there will be more resources dedicated in DFAT, that, for instance, there is a single ambassador to NATO, for instance, rather than a role that is shared with other sort of representations or within the DoD, or in general, in terms of resourcing in the government? How do you think that might go? Are there signals as to stepping up that ambition?
Look, there's definitely increased focus on the NATO relationship. Resourcing with government is always a difficult question. What I would say, though, is, as we're seeing with NATO, none of these issues are single issues. So DFAT is a reasonably small agency and very light, and that gives us flexibility and agility, but it means that we don't have strong representation, you know, particularly large teams on issues. But that is to some degree disguised by the fact that these issues aren't DFATs alone, and the issues that NATO is focusing across every aspect of Australian government. So it's that united approach and leaning on experts from every government department, pooling resources so that we can give that focus to the issues and make sure that we have the right people providing the right advice. DFAT can't and shouldn't do everything. We're a convening force. And there's a range of specialties and expertise that we provide. But in terms of NATO and the security issues, you need cyber experts, you need climate experts, crisis management. And so people from across the Australian government are involved in that engagement with NATO, and DFAT supports that engagement. But even in terms of the centres of excellence, we've got a whole range of Australian officials rotating through those centres as well. So it's a whole of government effort. And it is, we have particularly driven and passionate people involved in it. The question of whether we'll get more passionate people involved is a more difficult one. But I think it is really leaning on that whole of government effort that makes a difference.
So we'll keep an eye on that budget in hyperinflationary times, and yeah, hope for the best. Okay, we will be diplomatic then about that. Now on that question of, and I think that this is a really interesting aspect of right-sizing that cooperation, as Ms. Spencer already said, this sort of idea that NATO is not just about military or security cooperation, and at the same time, as Professor Frühling said, NATO is basically the only sort of successful model of multilateral deterrence that we have out there, right? And the sort of model that many are pointing to when they call for similar sort of modes of engagement. Maybe Stefan, if you could offer your perspective on right-sizing that cooperation, because I think within the sort of scholarship on NATO, there is always this sort of debate of what NATO should be or shouldn't be focusing on, right? What are those issues? And I hope also Dr. Berti can fill us in as well from the HQ perspective and some of the discussions there. What are the issues that Australia can meaningfully cooperate on, and where some of these things might be better left to other organizations, or even for NATO itself, where is it that it could contribute? And of course, the sort of functional kind of debate is also one that, you know, is often accompanied then with that sort of geographical sort of focus, right? Where, you know, where NATO needs to really put its focus. And I think you already alluded to that. So your thoughts, and then we might get to Dr. Berti.
No, I think it's a good question. I think part of the problem is that part of the problem is that just prioritization. I mean, we're underdone in a lot of areas, not just in NATO, also in the Southwest Pacific, Southeast Asia, and so on. And if you come to prioritization, it's not that surprising that government is kind of like looking quite closely and that resources are flowing elsewhere. But I think there's also a problem. We've I think long-term struggled to actually really define an objective for our relationship on both sides. I mean, and beyond Afghanistan. I mean, on NATO's part, that was partly by design. I think in Canberra we struggled with that as well. And I think you could see that how NATO responsibility has bounced around, for example, internally in DFED, you can kind of like see it never really fit quite in any of the areas that it was before. I think it ended now in international security. I do think that today, I mean, we want to be present at the senior summit discussions, and I think and build those links at leadership level. And I think that we are there. I do think we want to have input and influence on the work, the supporting work on Indo-Pacific issues in particular in NATO headquarters. And I think that we've made a lot of progress there in the last few years, in particular through secondees. We want to have access to the technical fora where we see value. And I think that, again, in the first few years, there was actually reluctance in Canberra to engage too much because they just saw a huge bureaucracy that would suck up the whole kind of like diplomatic attaché corps in Europe. And so I think that we're a lot more comfortable and familiar with that now. And we want to be interoperable militarily and politically also in case of future joint operations. And I think that those are actually the right boxes and the right objectives. And I think we've made a lot of progress towards them. Does it mean that we should do more? I think, yeah, I think there's probably still opportunities that we're not exhausting. Partly that's because NATO is a hugely complex organization. There's an awful lot of different parts all over member states. And for example, the NATO strategic commands and in particular, for example, Allied Command Transformation in North America, I think from Australia, NATO is kind of like associated with Brussels. A lot of NATO stuff happens in the member states, and it took us a few years, I think, to cotton on that if you're the defense kind of like rep in Washington, that there's actually a very significant NATO work going on. That just wasn't on really people's radar because NATO was done in Brussels. And so I think that there still is a learning process that we're discovering parts of NATO that by accident we didn't really encounter. I think a good example is, for example, Maritime Command. I mean, NATO ran the counter-piracy operation for many years in the Indian Ocean, and we never really leveraged that into building a relationship on this. We never participated. We kind of ran things in parallel. I think these days we probably would be a bit more strategic about that. But overall, I think we're on the right direction, and a lot of the issues that need to be kind of like resolved is partly just building greater familiarity with the organization on both sides.
Dr. Berti, your thoughts in terms of right-sizing that cooperation and the sort of question of functional areas. Is there any, from the HQ's perspective, a particular set of areas, or it's really comprehensive and obviously recognizing that Australia, along with the other AP4 countries, has been in this process of negotiating new sort of partnership agreements as of late. So if you could speak a bit about that.
Sure. I would say that I would agree with the assessment that has been made so far in terms of the trajectory here is an upward one. The trajectory is one in which the number of issues that are discussed at both the political level and then are operationalized through practical cooperation has been expanding for a few years now. It's not necessarily something that comes just after the strategic concept. It really, in that sense, the concept reflects a direction of travel that has been, I think, ongoing for a few years now. I would agree that there's been an evolution of the partnership, and that at the beginning, of course, one of the main focuses was, as was mentioned, missions and operations and interoperability in that context, and that's, of course, was driven by Afghanistan primarily, but since then, we have, I would say, moved forward in looking at how to deepen and really expand that cooperation agenda. And it was already mentioned, but I think it is worth repeating that over the last year, we have had a foreign ministerial meeting with our Indo-Pacific partners invited, and that was followed up by a summit. That is politically, I think it's a politically quite clear signal of where the alliance sees, of how much the alliance values its partnership in the Indo-Pacific region, and clear signal of the desire to do more when it comes to decision shaping and consultation. So I think that is really something that in the day-to-day work of NATO, I see happening in terms of having more political consultations with our partners in general, and specifically with our Indo-Pacific partners and Australia, of course. Then one element that I think we should add to that is that we are agreeing to do more together, and we are agreeing to do more together not just because we share the same values and a similar outlook on the strategic environment, but also because I think there is a mutual, and from Australia, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's a mutual understanding that we are faced with systemic challenges, global challenges that do really require like-minded partners to come together regardless of geographical boundaries. Exactly as was said before, that doesn't necessarily mean a military presence in the Indo-Pacific. That's not what this is about, but it is about sharing information. It is about exchanging best practices. This is about training, building mutual capacity on issues from cyber defense to emerging new and disruptive technologies, to countering disinformation, to tackling the challenge of climate change. These are all issues that we're all tackling at the same time, and where we have, I think, we can bring value, both sides can bring real value to the discussion. So I think it's very much the direction of travel that I see. And of course, I would also add to the table resilience. We're doing more and more on resilience as allies. This is an area where we can exchange ideas and exchange best practices and also learn from partners. I think when it comes to resilience and countering this malign interference and dealing with identifying and mitigating strategic vulnerabilities, I believe Australia, for example, would be able to teach us a thing or two. So there's a number of areas where I think we will continue to cooperate, and I see that as a trend that is going to be intensified.
That's great, and I might still put you on the spotlight while we have you on a roll here, because a couple of times now we've mentioned the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific partners. We still talk about the AP4, unless I've missed on a memo, but the region is Indo-Pacific, so kind of reconciling between the two. My question for the sort of Brussels view of things, or Riga view of things at the moment, if you're there. So putting Estonia on a spotlight there, or Latvia, that is. Sorry about that, missing my Baltics. But the sort of question of dealing with the partners rather than a partner in this region, right? That there has been a sense that from NATO's perspective, as seen also at the Madrid summit, right, the photo is with the Secretary General and the four prime ministers of the Asia Pacific Four, which are Australia, New Zealand, Republic of Korea, and Japan. Is there a preference to basically deal with these countries as a grouping rather than on an individual basis? Or are we just maybe reading too much into that? And I know this because we are at the US Study Center as well here. And I think that there has been this sort of trend that we have noticed, at least, a move away from the sort of hub and spokes model for US alliances and more towards something that looks like greater sort of cooperation among the Asia Pacific allies of the United States, precisely to kind of make them more interoperable, right? To build those capacities, to share knowledge, to build resilience, all of those things that Dr. Bertie has said. So that was a very long question, but basically, does Brussels, does HQ have a preference in terms of dealing with the region? Would that be more bilateral or unilateral?
It's a very good question, and I would pick up on your point. Let's not read too much, or let's not take the strategic concept necessarily as an indication that there is a desire to put less focus on the bilateral relations, because of course each and every partner has its own relationship with NATO when it comes to the cooperation agenda, and that's tailored to both our needs and the partners' needs. I don't think that's going anywhere. And of course, even in a region like Indo-Pacific, we know that our different partners have different level of expectations and with respect to how to interact with NATO. So that remains, I think, very important. And I don't believe that there is a desire to shift completely from looking at bilateral to looking only through a regional focus. I also don't think that would necessarily be functional in this security environment. Again, many of the challenges we face are really global, and we can build cooperation and share knowledge by working with countries in different parts of the world on issues like cybersecurity, on issues like countering hybrid threats, disinformation. Perhaps we can think functionally rather than regionally, just throwing it out there. But I think the point of the strategic concept, and I think that's why you don't see a list of individual partners, is we're trying to look at the longer term. We're trying to look at the strategic direction, and we're indicating what are some regions in the world that are either of strategic importance to the alliance, like it says in the concept for the Western Balkans and the Black Sea region, directly relevant to Euro-Atlantic security, like we say for the Indo-Pacific, connected to stability of the Euro-Atlantic area, like we say for the Middle East and the Sahel and our eastern neighborhood. So we're looking really at what is the global picture and what are the relationship with different regions. And I think that's the right level of strategic thinking for that kind of document. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are shifting a policy and we are abandoning a tailored approach. I think that would not be a suitable way forward, especially, as I said, different partners do bring different needs and different skills to the table, and they have different expectations from NATO and vice versa. So there will always be a level of tailored bilateral cooperation. But at the same time, we know that for certain topics and for certain conversation, those are germane to be had in a broader format. So I think I think the strategic context tries to say as much, that we will keep a level of flexibility to be able to be effective in this changing geopolitical environment. So I think that should be the driving principle, rather than confine us one way or another.
Understood. View from Canberra on this front.
Look, I would agree with that entirely. There is, we have very strong bilateral engagements with NATO, but there is also benefit in the AP4 grouping. And we work very collaboratively with our A4 partners outside of the NATO context as well. It's useful to have those discussions and then be able to go back and bring a broader view. So it's not just an Australian position on something. There's a broader grouping within the Asia Pacific region. that share a similar view and have common challenges in a whole range of international security issues. So I think there's benefit in both. We would be concerned, as has just been said, about moving away from the kind of tailored approach, but having that flexibility to be able to work with partners in the region and bring a diverse view and work collaboratively within that diversity. Yeah.
Great. And before we open up the floor for questions, I had one sort of final question, which deals with the sort of institutional balance of power, or to put it very plainly, what to do in a 30-member state alliance when you have countries that have a lot of interest in, a lot of interest in the Indo-Pacific, and some that are saying, hey, there's a fire in our backyard. We can't be possibly looking so far. To us, yes, China might be a sort of challenge, but it's not imminent. It's not anything that really we care about, given everything that has happened from February 24th onwards, or arguably, you know, everything that has been happening since at least 8-9 years ago. So I'll open with Professor Fruehling, who might maybe shed some light on the fact that, and we don't necessarily need to talk about the United States here. I think that's pretty resolved. The US has a very clear Indo-Pacific orientation. We've had the new national security strategy published just a week ago, right? It's very clear as to what it sees its main challenge moving forward. Very clear in decoupling China and Russia, even though it sees that sort of entente between the two is a particular problem, but certainly signaling that Indo-Pacific is the key theater of interest for the United States. But then on the European NATO side, the kind of divisions that there are between the likes of, say, you know, France as it sees itself as a sort of resident power in the region, and obviously, you know, we could talk about then some of the kind of countries in the region where Dr. Berti is currently, who would probably not be sharing that sort of view. Maybe I'm wrong in terms of, you know, what the kind of priorities are.
Yeah.
Are.
Okay. I think it's a really important point. I mean, the short answer is it's complex. I mean, but I think it's also. I mean, the times have moved a long way in the last 15 years. I mean, in the beginning, we couldn't even be called a partner. We were a contact country because of those concerns. I mean, that we've moved a long way from that. In the beginning, it was also the more maritime-oriented allies. I mean, the US, Dutch, to some Canadians, Brits that were keen on this. That's much broader now. And I think that partly is because the views of China have changed, and the views of how China is relevant for Indo-Pacific security have changed. And in a sense, it's not about, it used to be more concerns about NATO going to the Indo-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific is coming to NATO in many ways in that regard. And I think that has changed the debates. I mean, France has its own views on this, which are a bit different anyway. But I mean, these days, a lot of the China concerns is most acute actually in Eastern European countries. If you look at Lithuania and it's the beating that they took over Taiwan. If you look at, I mean, the Czech Republic was in a similar position. So I think that the framing of the challenge through authoritarianism, and as well as the practical cooperation that you see between Russia and China, have kind of like to some extent eroded the zero-sum approach of if you focus on one, you shouldn't focus on the other. I think that the terms of the debate have shifted there, which I think have eased a lot of the opposition, both on, or certainly in some areas of engaging this through the NATO format. Again, partly also because it's not necessarily about NATO doing something, but using NATO as a means for exchange. And I think that there, Australia does have an important role because we're not the Americans. I think just by virtue of us providing an independent view on what's happening in the region that's not the US view, that's something where we can have a lot of influence, in particular, as I said, exactly in those small countries that can't afford really to build up their own national expertise on this region.
Similar question to Dr. Berti. So NATO allies differing in their level of ambition as to the involvement or looking into the Indo-Pac.
Sure. So as a general comment, I would say that I think it's important to start by reminding ourselves that NATO, especially as it has been, especially in its more expanded, in its more expanded and recent format, is an alliance right now of 30, soon to be 32 countries, with different geographies, different national interests, a large strategic convergence, of course, which is what makes the alliance so solid, and a convergence of values. But the notion that different allies have different prioritizations when it comes to security threats and challenges, that's just something that NATO has worked with, I would say, from day one. So in that sense, it's not new per se, but you're right in mentioning that, of course, different allies have a different presence, interest, outlook towards the Indo-Pacific region. That's absolutely clear. Yet, I think we are of a very clear consensus in terms of how the alliance today, I don't know, in 10 years, things change, but how the alliance today is framing its strategic environment, and that is through the lens of strategic competition. That is by identifying Russia as a direct threat. So that's very clear. And that's also inevitable, because we haven't talked about Ukraine, of course, yet in this conversation, but for us, it's I cannot emphasize, I'm stating the obvious, but let me state it anyways. I cannot emphasize the devastating, profound consequences of having a full-fledged war in Europe, violating the basic principles of international law, bringing us back to the darkest times of European history, putting into question the European security order, hindering the rules-based international order, creating global disruptions. I'm just saying this because I would say there is no question from any of the allies that this has to be our first priority. We are in the midst of the gravest security crisis since the end of World War II. I would say this is the toughest security environment we've had as an alliance since the end of the Cold War, for sure. So that is all true. At the same time, we don't have the luxury to focus only on one issue, to focus only on one threat, or to not see the connections. And that's where I think allies are. They have been clear in the strategic concept of talking about China as posing strategic challenges. So we're talking about challenges. They are not defining China as a military adversary. That's not the language in the concept, but they are recognizing that there's coercive behavior that has an impact on our security. And of course, since the beginning of this brutal war in Ukraine, but even actually before the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we have seen examples of Russia-China cooperation that has, of course, also raised concerns. We've seen pretty problematic statements from our point of view in the weeks preceding the war from Russia and China about NATO and about de facto putting a veto on countries' right to freely choose their own alliances. That's not something we stand for. So it all comes together, and I think it's clear where the alliance is at the moment, and I think that's absolutely realistic and based on our security environment. So even though, yes, there are different nuances, I think you have pretty strong consensus through this document in saying we cannot afford to ignore this. We cannot afford not to have this discussion in NATO, and we cannot afford not to think about what's the transatlantic consensus on this question. It is essential for the future of our alliance, for the transatlantic bond as such. So I think we are able to navigate this complexity, keeping the priority that, of course, we are right now in a watershed moment for European security. So we have to keep our utmost attention on strengthening our deterrence and defense, and on supporting Ukraine in its right to self-defense. I would leave it at that.
Maybe final question then for Ms. Spencer here. You've been with DFAT since February, so I can't ask you how has February changed DFAT's perspective, but obviously given your work in the government and on issues of international security. How has, to turn that sort of question around, how has the invasion of Ukraine changed the assessments for Australia in terms of the way that it looks at Europe, the way that it looks at NATO?
Look, I think speaking really frankly at the foreign ministers meeting, particularly in April, but also the Leaders Summit, we were surprised that AP4 were involved and were invited. Our view was that, you know, we'd almost take a back seat for a little while, that, you know, with the invasion of Ukraine, that NATO had a lot more important and pressing issues, and that they would be less concerned with the Indo-Pacific, and that we would, you know, be waiting for our engagement to increase. And so we were really quite surprised at the ongoing interest in the Indo-Pacific and in collaborating with the AP4 and in seeking our views and our understanding and our perspectives on issues. Dr. Birdie may correct me. I think I've been told that there's a saying around NATO headquarters around Russia being the storm and China being climate change. And that they are sort of, there is a view within NATO of that long-term perspective. So I think we were quite grateful that there was that continued focus on the Indo-Pacific, very, very much of the view that, you know, the devastating circumstances in Ukraine and that the focus needs to be there, but that there is a perspective we can share on that, and on particularly around issues around cyber, around disinformation, and how that has played out through the Ukraine invasion. There is a different perspective that we can provide, and particularly with the kind of emphasizing of Russian narratives by others in our region, there's a perspective that we can share, and there is value that we can add to that. And also for us, there's a lot that we can learn from the experiences, and the work that we've done and the support that we've provided to Ukraine as a non-NATO member has been you know, it's been so important for us as a country to be able to do that. And I think that has shown again the global connectedness and the interconnectedness of every security threat. You know, it's not something that's limited to Ukraine, limited to Europe. It affects everybody globally, and there's not one issue that we deal with in international security that doesn't.
Yeah.
And so those partnerships become more and more important.
As we see every day, certainly in terms of the prices of commodities, whether they're soft or the traditional sort of hydrocarbons, to obviously the way that this reverberates then into issues of real human security and all the rest. That's absolutely phenomenal insights from all three of the panelists so far. We have about 15 or so minutes to open up for a Q&A with the audience in the room. So if we could start from over here. We have Major Rogers.
Good evening. Thank you to the panel for your time, and I appreciate you making time this evening, and I think in one case still probably morning. So as the various speakers addressed, NATO is the most successful example of a deterrence alliance, which inherently has a very strong military component. It later extended into other aspects of security, as y'all also noted. I'm thinking of the NATO Stability Policing Center of Excellence, which literally occupies the same facility as the EU's Gendarmerie Force. PESCO notwithstanding, the EU generally has much weaker, I think I'm safe in saying the EU has much weaker forms of cooperation, and coincidentally or not, I struggled with forms of security cooperation that weren't purely about military things. Atalanta, Sophia, the refugee operations in the Mediterranean. As we enter the multilateral era, does that history offer lessons for Australia? Does NATO's history encourage the idea of an AUKUS center of maritime law enforcement excellence, and that occasionally Canadians and Norwegians visit, or are these just all reflective of broader trends?
Look, I would say more reflective of broader trends. And, you know, AUKUS is a very different grouping and a much more, you know, it's a technical capability grouping rather than an alliance in the way that NATO is. I think, again, it goes to that point of global connectedness and how you best do that and where you find like-minded, and that can be very different for each country. And so hence the kind of focus on minilaterals to a degree. But there is a growing recognition that, as we said before, nothing operates alone, everything interacts across the globe, however small. So we've got to find ways to work and to manage opposition and disinformation to alliances that work to support the rules-based order and greater security collaboration. But I pass to other panel members.
Yeah, I might jump in here. I mean, I do think that, I'm not sure that I would say that the EU is weaker on cooperation. It's just, I mean, it focuses on different areas and it has significant strengths that NATO doesn't have, and expertise. I mean, in particular, it has money to spend, which NATO doesn't really in quite the same way. So I think that it's not a one or the other, it's horses for courses. And I think for Australia, the EU matters more on certain areas. I mean, if you look at the South Pacific, for example, I mean, the EU is really heavily engaged with its aid program and capacity building and so on, in a way that NATO couldn't and wouldn't want to. So I think that just as we do see much greater collaboration and exchange now between the EU and NATO, and I think to some extent that competitiveness has kind of dropped away a bit in that relationship. But I think likewise, as that happened, the closer cooperation with NATO, both Australia and NATO on security, I think is also mirrored in some ways on closer cooperation with the EU. It's obviously different fields and so on, but I think that greater European interest in Indo-Pacific developments is not just something that shows up in NATO. It also shows up in the Political Security Committee in the EU, for example, when Australia is engaging there. It's just focused on different areas. So I think that just as NATO and EU are probably more complementary now than competitive, at least than they used to be a few years ago, I think the same dynamic is also kind of like replicated in the way that both organizations are increasingly important for us.
No, I don't think I don't think it's my place to give an advice on Australian foreign policy. So I'd rather listen than contribute on this one.
Yield the floor. That's good. And both NATO and the EU obviously published key strategic documents with the same acronyms this year. And I've heard that they are talking much more than they ever have before. So strategic concept for one, the strategic compass for the other, and a lot of ambition for sure from the EU to become a more capable security and military actor and player over there. Sure.
This is better, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if we can keep it a question rather than a comment, please.
Yeah. I think I need to put a framework, otherwise. All right. So like practically, let me go to the question: what is the relevance, considering that actually? Sorry, jumping one sub sort of thing that I forgot to mention. I become philosopher observing human or Western bias. So we are in the age of biggest Western propaganda. Okay, I don't trust anything I read in the media or most of the things, because I can think for myself. Now, what is the relevance for Australia, in NATO, when we are actually part of Asia, and now we are Asian century, to remind you, 100 years. So we should be more independent and think about neighbors first, rather than trying to be barking dog, because usually the dogs get poisoned first when there's a fight between the neighbors. So we should be really thinking we are isolated island, and coming from IT, and I understand really well artificial intelligence, we see now the dangers of Optus and Medibank.
Right.
That's much bigger danger.
Yeah,
So let's focus on what is the relevance of NATO.
Yeah. Okay. So where should the focus lie? Is there a peril of ignoring the backyard? I don't.
Well, my position is that we're not ignoring the backyard. We have a range of relationships with partners, and our regional partners are some of the most important that we have. But as we've talked about all evening, the threats are global, and so we need to look to all like-minded. But it's definitely not at the detriment of our region. And, you know, looking at the government and the work that our foreign minister's been doing recently, the Pacific and Southeast Asia are prime in terms of our relationships and the work that we do.
I think that's broadly the consensus. Do we have a question over there?
I had a question for Dr. Birdie. So in government, obviously things move pretty slowly. I can only imagine how slowly things might move in a big beast like NATO. How long did it take to develop the strategic concept, and how far into that process did the Ukraine crisis kind of hit, and how much that kind of changed the initial assumptions you were working towards?
Sure. So the short question, that's a really good question, and I would say that the process of drafting and pre-negotiations and start to finish took from September to June, so roughly 9 months, I would say. In reality, I would say that some of the strategic thinking about the shifts in the security environment and how they affect the alliance have been ongoing for at least the prior couple of years. After the London summit in 2019, allies asked the Secretary General to think about how to strengthen NATO politically. That became an initiative that we call NATO 2030. And it was very practical. It was focused on what do we need to adapt to make sure the alliance is future-proof. But inevitably, in order to think about how to future-proof something, you have to think about how is the environment changing. So I think some of the discussions on strategic competition, on resilience, really predated the concept in a way. So we had been conceptually thinking about it for a couple of years. Then on the second part, I have to say, this is a question that we got a lot, and meaning how much did the analysis change after the war in Ukraine? And I want to be completely honest, it's a change in tone, it's a change in urgency, it's a recognition of the fact that we are in the darkest time for European security in many years. So there is a change in tone. But in terms of the pre-February draft of the concept that we had on the table, it didn't describe the world in a substantially different way. It still said we're going to be more in a world that is more competitive, more contested. Strategic competition was already there. Perhaps I would say, to be honest, the language on Russia would probably wouldn't have been as direct. But the analysis was that we had a largely destabilizing actor in the Euro-Atlantic area. That's something that we really came to terms with after the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. Some say, well, you could have come to terms with that after Georgia in 2008, or even after President Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007 and basically laid out his vision for a completely different security architecture, rejecting the post-Cold War, if you wish, arrangements. But nevertheless, I would say since 2014, there's been a continuous shift in understanding of the world that has led to the most significant military adaptation of the alliance for decades. So in that sense, yes, the war is atrocious, is complete deterioration of the security environment. But if I look 2 levels above and I look at the megatrends, it exacerbates them, it doesn't change them. So in other words, we adjusted the tone, but the overall assessment was fairly similar, I'm afraid.
There was a question.
Hello, thanks very much for the panel, which has been incredibly interesting. And is this on?
It's on. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. I just have a practical question. I should introduce myself. I'm Carolyn Cartier. I teach both global governance and contemporary China at UTS. So I see the intersections of these issues and their increasing significance. So I just have a practical question for the colleagues who work in Australian government. And that is, what about the structure of government in the way that it may be disposed or indisposed to rising to or being interested in or becoming more involved in not the NATO mandate so much, but the real world challenges that have come into the Asia-Pacific and which historically NATO has been concerned with. We have these kind of new intersecting geographies that don't map on to the old transatlantic order neatly anymore. And so what is it, and perhaps, I'm not sure if this is even the right question because I don't work in Australian government, but what in Australian government perhaps structures or opens up to the possibilities of this kind of engagement that we first see sort of, if I understand correctly, on the sidelines in Spain? Is the Australian government kind of predisposed to this, or are there structures of the bureaucracy and its existing kind of mandates and silos particularly that in the Australian bureaucratic system tend to limit the potential of crossing over? Thank you.
Interesting question, and I might not be the best placed, and I might press to the professor as well. Look, my view is that there aren't any structural barriers. As we've dealt more and more with these kind of cross-cutting security issues, we've been open to talking to a whole range of different partners. I think some of it are cultural aspects, which we have across the board. So, you know, I think previously that view of NATO had been a defense and military view, and that had been that kind of defense relationship. I guess DFAT's involvement has been newer as it's gone into more emerging security issues, and then being able to bring in others from across government as well. So I don't think there's structural barriers, but it's that kind of ongoing cultural piece of how you bring people together and avoid those silos. But I think that goes more to, you know, I think that's something we see across the board with cross-cutting security issues, and something we've had to deal with across government rather than necessarily something specific to NATO. But Professor, did you have?
No, look, I think it's an interesting question to think about. I mean, I do think that certainly in the early days of the partnership, there were still undertones of like, you know, the old Europe versus Asia focused debate. And is this kind of like going back to the 50s and 60s, or in terms of us focusing on our Northern Hemisphere allies? I think that's dropped away, just as I think people have realized that it's not, and that the issues are ultimately the issues that we care about, that are discussed in the relationship. I do think that there is there is an issue about, I mean, is this a geographic? Do you look at this through a geographic lens or a functional lens? And I think that the system is struggling with that. So I mean, for a while, NATO was, I think, in the Eastern European section in DFAT. I mean, that wasn't really quite where it belonged. But I think that, I mean, having it in international security, I do think that we're probably missing a bit an opportunity to think about how much do we engage kind of like European countries in Brussels as opposed to in their capitals. And so I think that that's something that I'm not sure that the balance is right there. And likewise, I think certainly in defense, again, it's in the international policy area, but in many ways it's actually more relevant for the functional area. So it's kind of, but that's just the norm. That's just a fact of life of complex organizations. I think that's not really specific to NATO. And I think that to some extent, I think we should also not underestimate the fact that it's now become almost a habit for Australian prime ministers to go to summits. And I think that kind of like in itself like raises prominence, but also like helps to focus and integrate policy at a national level in a way that probably wouldn't happen and probably didn't happen when it was still more at the official level and maybe ministerial level. And I think that ability for prime ministers to come is not just because of the level at which you can engage a valuable thing, but I think also in that sense of consolidating, if you like, national views on what can be achieved in that relationship.
That's great. And if we have time for one final question from the audience over there.
Thank you, the panelists, for the time tonight. My question, in short, is what do you think of the real prospects of a new Cold War since the Warsaw Pact was dissolved in 1991, and there was the Russia coming to the West and the West acceptance of Russia as a new partner, but for the initial 10, 15 years, and now like there's all of a sudden this military conflict, at least, and now it's still in a regional scale between Russia and Ukraine. And what's the prospect of a new, I don't think, I honestly do not think there'll be direct military conflict between Russia and any NATO countries, because that's going to start at World War III, for sure. Because as Dr. Florling has said, NATO is such a strong alliance of deterrence, and each side has strong nuclear capabilities. So what do you guys think of the prospects of a new Cold War on a global scale, considering we're talking about de-linking of China and this being the strong strategic alliance of China and Russia? So
just an easy essay type question to wrap our discussion tonight.
Sure, I can be really quick. Well, it's not a question you can answer quickly, but let me start with one point that I want to make. It's quite important. It's important to me. Words matter. So I would say there's not a conflict in Europe right now. There is a war of aggression by one country, the Russian Federation, that has invaded a sovereign country and is now involved in a brutal war with devastating consequences for the country's civilian population, with documented cases that can only be described as atrocities. So let's just be clear, there's not all of a sudden a conflict between two countries. There is one country that has invaded another country and is now attacking it. I wouldn't say this is out of the blue. I wouldn't say this is, of course, the escalation is something that we haven't seen in European soil for a while, but the behavior, and that's what I go back to, this is not something we have seen since that 2007 speech, but of course, even more since the illegal annexation of Crimea. We have seen the Russian Federation playing an incredibly destabilizing role. We have seen it doing so with provocative military exercising. We've seen it doing so through interference in democratic elections, disinformation, cyber attacks, occupation of sovereign countries, etc., etc., etc. So this has been the trend. And I think it's important that we remember it because, of course, after the end of the Cold War, NATO extended cooperation with Russia. It offered to Russia a level of tailored engagement and partnership that has not been offered to anyone else. So we really opened that door. But of course, you have to be two to tango. So after the legal annexation of Crimea, we had to put a stop to business as usual. You don't do business as usual to a country that invades its sovereign neighbor for no reason. You just simply can't. And of course, now the situation is you're absolutely correct. We are in the worst relationship with the Russian Federation since the end of the Cold War. That is just a fact. That's not where we want to be. And if you read everything we are saying is that we believe in a European security order based on international law, based on sovereignty, based on the right of each country to freely choose its alliances and conduct its foreign policies. These, by the way, are also principles that Russia had agreed to, but of course it's now violating. So the point is that the alliance is interested in stability and in predictability in the Euro-Atlantic area. A change in the relationship with Russia can only occur if Russia changes its behavior. stops this absurd and brutal war and returns to compliance with international law. So that's where we are. If to me, that's not the parallel with the Cold War. Is I don't know how helpful it is. Let me be honest. I think it mirrors the situation was quite different then. First of all, the notion of you have a much more complex security environment now, interlinkages as we've mentioned. There is a strategic competition. We're talking about China and Russia. I'm not sure it's a good parallel, but I would say if you ask Ukrainians, they would say, well, actually there is no a Cold War. There is a brutal war of aggression going on every day in our country. So perhaps step one is to put a stop to it, and then we can take it from there. I think that would be my reaction.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berti. We are aware of your timetabling and scheduling constraints, so we thank you for your excellent participation today and insights, and we'll let you proceed with your day over in Riga. So we'll just leave it for some final remarks from Professor Frilling and from Ms. Spencer. But for you, we say goodbye. We will still stay online for another 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
New Cold War?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a good question. I mean, I agree with Benedetta that probably you don't want to draw too many parallels to the old Cold War, but I think it's worth reminding that NATO, I mean, as in the organization, was formed exactly to keep the war cold rather than have a hot war in the context of the Korean War. I mean, back in '49, you largely just had the treaty. And NATO as an organization really arose out of a realization that just wishing for war not to go hot is not enough. You actually need to prepare and work for it to remain cold. And I think that that's where NATO is moving back towards. And I think that, coming back to my earlier theme, I mean, I think that there's some lessons there from us, because we never even in the Cold War time period I mean, we've all forgotten about CETO, let's face it. I mean, that was kind of like our one attempt at trying to do something similar. But we've never really relied on our alliances to keep a war from going hot rather than remaining cold. And so I think that what we're seeing now in NATO is solutions that are obviously kind of like reflecting the European, transatlantic, geographic, political kind of like circumstances, but the problems of how do you work as allies to make sure that wars remain cold rather than going hot are the same that I think we're increasingly facing. And I think that if you look at what's happening in the US-Japan and the US-Korean alliance and in the US-Australia alliance over the last 10 years or so, you see us inching towards grappling with similar issues that NATO was originally set up to do, both in terms of practical cooperations and even more importantly in kind of like that political military kind of like piece that is so essential if you want to like work as allies and for deterrence.
Great, thank you. And we save the best for last.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think I can add much more to what the experts have said, so happy to leave it there.
Happy to try to make sure that we leave all the wars cold rather than escalating and becoming hot. Well, this brings us to the very end of our scheduled time today. Thank you all for being here despite the not so great weather in general in Sydney, but also the sort of time after probably a very long day for everyone and long weeks that pretty much everyone has had these days. I do want to thank again all three of the panelists. Thank you, Ms. Spencer, first of all, for flying from Canberra to be here with us after a long set of trips you've had in the lead up to this. Thank you, Professor Frilling, for taking time of your Kyoto afternoon, and obviously we thanked Dr. Berti. I want to also thank my colleagues from the U.S. Studies Center's events and communications team. So Ms. Janine Pinto for her help as the best events manager one can have, and Ms. Kopika Nair, who has done all of the things that happen on the social media and communication side. So if you follow us on Twitter, Instagram, or whichever other platform you would be probably engaging with Gopika's great work. We also invite you all to obviously keep on attending our events. We will have some more things coming up in the lead up now to the midterms. It's a pretty busy season politically in the US, and it's going to be quite an interesting one. We're going to have some further research related events, but for now, obviously, and to all of the audience out there on the World Wide Web as well, thank you for being with us, and I hope to see you on another one of these that we could do more in person rather than just Zoom or hybrid. So thanks again, and thank you to the panelists again for the great contributions. Okay. Okay, that's a different conflict, different region.